Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smoko podcast. My name is Alexis Armstrong, your host. Nice to meet you. The Smoko podcast is the place to celebrate and highlight women, trans women, and non binary folk working within STEM and trade occupations. So please tune in, take a break, join us. We are on Smoko. Today, we are extremely lucky to be joined by the lovely Nicole Tatman, who is a wildlife biologist and conservationist, as the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, where she works as a big game program manager. So her specialty is really focusing on elk populations within northern New Mexico and understanding population vitality, predation rates, pathogens. She does basically everything about big game conservation and elk population conservation. And so I cannot wait to talk to her more about elk biology, wildlife biology, conservation in general, kind of the relationship between conservation and hunting, and just what her job is and what she does. Because the first time that I spoke to Nicole, she told me a little bit about how they collect that data. And even just that story has blown my mind. So I can't wait to have this conversation. And Nicole, thank you so much for coming onto the show. It is so nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alexis. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm really excited for this episode because I love all things wildlife conservation and wildlife biology. I think it's maybe growing up watching a lot of David Attenborough documentaries, but I'm just very excited to learn more. And maybe that's kind of how we start off, is just asking how you fell in love with big game biology and how you discovered the field of wildlife biology. How did you get into it? What drew you to this specialty? How did that happen?
Yeah, I guess you and I share the fact that we really enjoy nature documentaries and David Attenborough in particular. That man has the perfect voice to narrate anything going on in
Mhm.
nature and make you really engaged in it. So that definitely got me interested in wildlife and being outside. But in addition to that, my dad and parents would take us camping. And
Mm.
so I had a really, I guess, connection to the outdoors by doing that. And wildlife in particular. I remember when I was a kid, my dad would fish. He'd fly fish on small rivers and he'd catch some fish. And I'd be like really interested in looking at the fish and seeing what it looked like, seeing what it felt like. But I always wanted him to throw it back because I wanted the fish to stay there in the landscape. I have a little bit, I guess, of a different take on that now that I'm a trained biologist. But yeah, just sort of an active mind in the outdoors. I would catch
Mhm.
lizards in my backyard and keep them in terrariums in my bedroom when I was, 10 years old. So, yeah, just a genuine interest for what is going on outside. So, yeah, that's sort of what got me engaged in the first place. I actually thought I wanted to be a zookeeper when I
Mm.
grew up and got my first big girl job, but I didn't realize that wildlife biology, field biology was a thing at the time. So, it's a little
Mm.
bit better of a fit for me.
I love that answer. And I love that it was always this kind of natural thing for you and a genuine interest in the outdoors and animals and understanding the natural world. I think that's so cool because it doesn't usually happen that often that women in these fields, they know that these fields exist or that they're interested in them at a young age, right? Like usually it's a stumble into them later in life. So I love that idea that you've always been a naturalist and catching lizards and having a terrarium. I mean, I don't think many kids have that. So that's wonderful that that was kind of part of your childhood. And that's very cool. And how did the progression happen of now deciding and discovering kind of wildlife biology? And then you work currently as a big game program manager for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, where you kind of measure wildlife populations and you help create recommendations on how to manage them. How did that happen? Like, how did you go from school to now this job? And for those maybe who aren't within this field, could you kind of describe what your job actually means? What I just said, what does that actually mean? And how do you conduct this research? What does that look like?
I guess I got further interested in just more specifics of wildlife biology and field biology through some work study jobs I took as an undergraduate. Because again, I thought I wanted
Mm.
to be a zookeeper. I thought that's the only way you could interact with wildlife was to be a zookeeper. And that sounded really interesting to me. But in taking some jobs at my university as an undergrad, I learned that there's this bigger field that you can go outside and interact with wildlife and you can
Mhm.
catch wild animals that are really wild and hold them in your hand and tag them and then put them back and see what they do. And so I had a couple of field jobs that were really valuable in allowing me to explore more field biology a bit. So what I do now is I oversee myself and my team oversee the management and research of ungulates across the state of New Mexico. And so an ungulate is something with a hoof.
Mm,
Usually these are animals that can be hunted. And so what we do is we assess populations, see how they're doing across the state. So we do that in kind of in a variety of manners, but one of the more common ones is flying a helicopter survey. And so
yeah.
we'll talk about elk since you brought it up, but we'll survey an elk population. We'll classify the animals. Say we have so many adult females, adult males, and how many calves we have. And so with that information, we can assess how the population is doing. If there aren't
Mm,
as many calves as we expect, there might be something going on, and we might need to investigate it further. So those are sort of our some of our metrics that we use to assess populations. And then we're really tasked with making sure these populations are sustained on the landscape
mm,
and in the context of hunting and just, I guess, conservation and wildlife enthusiasts in general, because there's a variety of wildlife users, I guess is what we call them, but they're just people that like wildlife in one way or another, and
yeah.
not everybody that likes wildlife hunts. So we're managing the species for everybody. So we're managing these species so they are maintained on the landscape so that they're around for future generations. And so we do that by, indexing the populations and flying those surveys. If there's something going on, let's say there's a disease issue in bighorn sheep, we'll often
Hmm.
partner with a university to figure out if there's any path forward or what we might be able to do to address that. So I guess that's what I do sort of on a day-to-day basis.
I love it on multiple levels. I love the kind of progression of zookeeper to be like, "Oh my goodness, you can go outside." Like, basically, that's it, of being like, you're allowed to go outside and see these populations and in real terms, and to see kind of like real world dynamics and population vitality of it and like ecology of it in a natural setting. So I love that you had that first kind of glimpse that that existed and then you went down that path. I think that's gorgeous, but I also think that your day to day is so interesting, and what you guys do as a department is just it's so important for conservation, and it's also just so important to have that kind of metric and data of population through time. When you talk about like we don't have as many calves as we would expect, are you looking at past population sizes? Are you looking at kind of, is there something that you compare it to? How do you get that data?
Yeah, so when we're looking at calves or fawns or any kind of a juvenile in a particular population, there's sort of a number that we would like to see. So let's say it's like 35 calves per 100 cows. That gives us an idea of there are enough calves that are being born to sustain the population and replace animals that are dying of old age or from other or
Okay.
predation or other causes. So that base level is sort of we're looking to either see that baseline or have it a little bit higher, in which case the population is doing better than just baseline
Expected.
maintaining itself and it might be increasing.
Okay. It's just a cool different way of thinking about conservation, because I may think maybe for someone who's outside of the field, we don't really think of populations like that, of being like we're maintaining it for everybody who's using the natural space. So we're looking at hunting, we're looking at just conservation for conservation, we're looking at population dynamics. I think it's like a different way to look at a population that maybe someone like me has no idea that you do it. Usually you're like, okay, well, we just want as many elk as possible. And it's just kind of this infinite number, but it's different to think of populations in terms of a resource perspective almost.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that sometimes what gets missed a little bit is that as humans, we rely on functional, intact ecosystems for our own survival, right? We need honeybees to pollinate
Mhm.
plants, and we need all of these species on the landscape so that we can also sustain ourselves, right? And elk and deer and bighorn sheep and their predators, they're all part of that equation. And so I guess I really enjoy the fact that I am in a role to help manage those big dynamic
Mhm.
species for intact ecosystems, especially, I mean, people really love seeing big dynamic
Yeah.
mammals, right? They're really,
Yes.
yeah, they're exciting to see. It's, big bull that's bugling in the rut is one of the most cool things
Gorgeous.
you'll ever see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they
Yeah.
have this spotlight just in the fact that they're large and people can see them and they're fun to see. But I guess all in all, they sort of have this place of we're managing them for the whole ecosystem, right? And people may value one part of that ecosystem. Maybe they just value the elk and they don't know anything about the behind the scenes things, but they value
Mhm.
that particular resource, the elk on the landscape. And as such, sort of landscapes can be conserved a little bit better, a little easier, maybe I should say,
Mhm.
because somebody values even just one part
One
of it.
thing. Yeah, exactly. Like one part of it has a whole holistic kind of consequence of it, and it represents like a position within a natural space and a natural ecosystem that maybe we don't know everything about it, being someone on the outside, not a biologist. So I love that aspect of it and that mentality of kind of this holistic thing. Nicole, I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit about how you do this research, because not only is this research so valuable, but how you do it is really interesting as well. And part of your field work is to capture a big game. You talked a little bit about helicopter studies, but could you kind of walk through how you go from a helicopter study of just getting maybe rough numbers to actually getting some data on like pathogens or on population health? How do you get that data?
Yeah, so that's a bit more intense than just a regular helicopter survey. The most common way we do it is a helicopter capture. So we use a similar machine, but this time we want to get those animals in hand and we want to equip them with a GPS collar or some sort of a tracking device that will allow us to follow them to see, where they move, where they migrate maybe, or even when they die and what caused them to die. This tracking device can give us a variety of pieces of information that helps us make informed decisions on how to manage that population. But we get to use a net gun fired from a helicopter. So, what that is this modified gun that rather
Uh-huh.
than shooting a bullet, it has these big weights. And the weights sort of like go into this little basket, and there's four. And so,
Hmm.
picture a big, massive net with four weights, one on each side of a square, right? And so we're flying in this helicopter, and we have to have pilots and people who are very experienced at doing this because it can be a little
Very
dangerous. But
specialized. Yeah.
yeah, very
Huh.
specialized. Yeah. And so they both like pilot and the net gunner sort of discuss, all right, we're going to go for this animal. And then it's like a very quick, lots of communication. Like, okay,
Yeah.
take that one in the back right. The net gunner sort of leans out of the helicopter, and the pilot sort of like will move, like tilt the helicopter sideways almost, and then
So
the net gun is
crazy. Yeah.
shot. Yeah. The net gun is shot, and so the idea is to get that net over that animal, and so get it sort of caught up in the net, and then we land really close by, and then go and grab that animal and sort of physically restrain it and put a collar on it and get it on its way. But so it's a pretty stressful thing for that animal though, right?
Yeah.
Like and the reason we do that rather than darting an animal or chemical immobilizing it from a helicopter, which is another way to do it, but the net gun method, it doesn't have any drugs related to it. So we're
Mhm.
not sedating the animal, because when we do sedate the animal, that has like physical consequences to that
Totally.
individual animal.
Yes.
So like
Yeah.
the heart rate goes down and they're already in a stressful situation. So comparatively, even though the net gun is it's big and
More
it's
hectic?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
hectic,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
hectic. But
Mhm.
for the animal, it doesn't have those consequences of a lowered heart rate or a lower respiratory
Mhm.
rate, and it can get back up on its feet and start moving quicker. And so that's the
Yeah.
most common way we catch these animals and put GPS collars on them. We can do chemical immobilization too with dart guns, but yeah, probably the most exciting is a net gun fired from a
Is the net
helicopter.
gun.
Yeah.
It's insane. Like, the way that you first described this, I remember just it melted my mind because I was like, I feel like this is something out of a movie or just, like, picturing, like, almost like a military precision and, like, quickness of the helicopter and the pilot and going down, like, just the
Yeah.
intensity of it because it's a very, very hectic kinda dynamic thing, but I think you're right that it's far better for the animal because they don't have long-lasting effects of, like, being chemically immobilized and also kind of they're able to get up right away and to function right away other than maybe being put in a vulnerable position. So it's better for the animal to do this technique obviously, but for you guys it's far more hardcore and far more like one aspect of it. I remember you telling me about this that once the net gun is on, the net is on the animal, you basically have to tackle a big game ungulate, like tackle an elk or tackle a sheep, which I don't know if everyone can do that. I don't think I could tackle a sheep. I think I would like sit there and be like, okay, well, like, please just like calm down. Like, please sit nicely. So I'm just like, I would try to reason with it. Like, I would not have the balls to be like, okay, I'm gonna like take that animal. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I got you. Like, I would never. I'd be so scared of it. So
Yeah.
I just think that that's a crazy aspect of your job.
I mean, it definitely takes some, I guess, courage to go up to that animal, and elk for me are just a little big. Like I'm not a large person and they can weigh like 400 pounds, right? And I've tried to, go get them down and
Tackle.
tackle them, but
Yeah.
yeah, you really need somebody that has a little more mass to them to do that. So we sort of like pick people for the jobs that will work. Like I'm pretty good with pronghorn. I can, get a
Okay.
pronghorn but they're only like 120 pounds. So yeah, anyway, it definitely takes not only some courage and a little bit of skill, but even some mass in some
Yeah.
cases and strength. Yeah.
Like, what went through your head the first time that you tried to tackle an elk? Like, was it just basically like, "Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit," or like,
Oh my
what
God,
was
dude.
that moment?
It was yeah, so it was with my boss at the time, and he was the net gunner, so he got the net on the elk, but she was still standing up, but she couldn't
Mhm.
she couldn't really move very quickly, so her legs were all caught in the net. And so I had watched these videos of my boss and somebody else doing this. And so
Yeah.
this what the guy did, the mugger is what we call it, who's the person that gets out and is supposed to do the tackling. This guy, he's like, I don't know, like 270 pounds. He goes and runs up to the elk and like pushes it over. And so that's
Yeah.
what I tried to do. But it's
Oh,
like a 400
no.
pound elk. And so I went like, boom.
And
Like I
hit
hit
off
the
of
elk.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
bounced off and I fell on the ground and the elk was just like, what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
excuse you. I was just having a great morning and now I have
Yeah.
this net on me. You just ran into
Yeah.
me like it was nothing. Oh my goodness. That's so funny. And like, I just had no idea that that's how you guys did it. Cause I guess on the nature documentaries, when you watch David Attenborough, you don't see that side of it. You don't see like the messy work of putting the collars on and seeing the original work to get that kind of tracking of the population. How much percentage of your job do you do that job? Like, does that happen only once in a blue moon? Do you usually do a pure helicopter survey first? Kind of what are the steps in that research?
We do captures of ungulates generally once a year, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year.
Okay.
Usually in cooler temperatures like the winter time because animals can get stressed out and
Mhm.
overheated, and so colder temperatures for them is better. It's maybe not as comfortable for us since we don't have those fur coats that they have, but yeah, so we do it pretty regularly, usually at least once a year for one project or another. Yeah.
It still just blows my mind that that's a job, and I'm sure, like, the newbies I'm sure you guys must crack up, like, watching other of your, like, first-time staffers be like, "Yep, go do it, get that
Yeah.
pronghorn." Like, I must it must be kind of like an internal joke thing of, like, watching other
Yeah,
people do that
yeah,
job.
it is. It is kind of funny, and some of the people that like people who are really good at it, they interact with
Mm.
livestock regularly, right? So they have cattle or they grew up
Oh.
around sheep or something like that, and so they sort of know how to work with these animals. So one of the people that has cattle, he's like, you should come and help us do some of our work one of these days and wrangle up some young cattle and can like give you some insights on how to handle something really big that's a lot
Mhm.
larger than you. And so that's really helpful. But yeah, I was definitely in that seat as somebody that folks were laughing at, like, why are you doing it that way?
Oh, that would be me. I'd be talking to it. I'm a city kid. Like, I would try to, like, reason with it, try to be like, "Okay, if I give you $10, will you just, like, please sit down?" Like, just like,
Yeah.
I would not know how to act with that animal, so I just it still blows my mind. And Nicole, for the next question, I don't know if this exists. Like, I know that your job is so dynamic, and not only do you do so many different types of species and so much different types of kind of conservation, but my next question is basically what is a typical day? But I know that your work has multi components. Like it's a combination of field work, lab, research, and then interacting with stakeholders. Does a typical day exist? And then, if yes or if no, what are kind of the main tasks that you have to do on a day to day?
I guess a typical day for office work or field work might exist, but I guess a
Okay.
typical office day would be, you know, interacting with stakeholders, talking about projects that we have ongoing and, planning logistics for the next steps of, well, we need to order more GPS collars for bighorn sheep. And so there's a lead time and sort of, yeah, logistics of just executing the things that we do on the ground or assessing populations, looking at their data, looking at trends
Mm,
in data, and seeing if we see anything strange, making sure,
mm,
essentially making sure populations are on the right track to at least be maintained at a certain level or increased or decreased depending on the situation at hand, right? A typical field day is usually very very hectic, but a lot of fun.
yeah.
Yeah, it's usually up very early before the sun, and typically you're working until the sun goes down and a little bit afterwards. So, like for captures, myself and my team are on the hook for getting everything together beforehand, going out into the field, making sure we have everything we need to keep that animal safe, make sure it's as comfortable as it can be in an uncomfortable situation, and all of our equipment like on hand so we can process the animals as quickly as possible and get them out of our hands, which is better for them, and that's what we want. But it takes a lot of logistics to do that, and so that can be really
Mhm.
stressful. A lot of moving parts, a lot of people in a field setting that have jobs or might have questions for you. Yeah, and then a lab day. Oh man, fortunately I don't have a lot of lab days because lab
Oh,
time
that's
is not
nice.
my favorite.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very
No,
nice.
it
I'm
is
not a
it's
lab person
interesting.
either.
It is interesting. I guess the lab time we do have is sort of logistics or for prepping for these sorts of captures and getting syringes and needles ready for blood draws and things like
Mhm.
that, but it's not intense lab time.
Everything is very suited to field work. Like field work
Yeah.
is kind of the bread and butter of your work, and that's where you get the actual data and understanding the population. So that makes sense. The rest of it is kind of just logistics and training almost to get ready for that big day.
Mhm.
And then the big day is just trying to manage the hecticness of it. And field work, everything always goes wrong. That's kind of the one rule of field work
Oh,
is
right?
something's gonna happen that's
Yeah.
gonna be unexplainable.
Yeah. There's not a field endeavor that I've done that goes exactly to plan, right? Something happens
Oh,
always.
yeah. No, something always happens, something always breaks, like, it's always kind of a last minute, "Oh my goodness," kinda try to scramble to try to figure out what you're gonna do about it and how you're gonna solve it. Very cool, thank you for kind of walking through the different aspects of it, though, because it's a complicated job, and it's definitely a multidimensional job. And one thing I wanted to talk about was kind of talking a little bit more about your research because that's also part of your job is really looking at this data and understanding it. And you mentioned trying to understand the patterns of this data. And the two that you're the most focused on is pathogens and predation, or that was my understanding. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to the risks facing big game populations right now. And then what do you think needs to be done to increase or maintain that population size?
Yeah, my I guess my academic expertise is in predator prey relationships, and lately I'm getting a more exposure in the disease realm, especially as it relates to
Mm,
bighorn sheep and the diseases that they face now in modern times. But I guess I'd step away from those two topics and say that what I see the biggest threat for wildlife in general, whatever the species may be, is habitat fragmentation and
okay.
people. We want to recreate and live in the same places that wildlife does, which is great because we value wildlife, but
Mhm.
they live there too. And like building a house means there's no wildlife that's going to live there anymore, right? It's going to be you. You're
Mhm.
going to live in the house. And so, yeah, I see just like the infrastructure for humans in the form of roads and communities being built. I guess I see that as one of the bigger threats for wildlife and everything associated with people. Like we all really like renewables, right? Or maybe we
Mhm.
all don't, but
But
there's a
yeah,
big
we
push
should.
for, yeah.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
There's a push for more renewables, which makes a lot of sense rather than energy extraction and getting our energy
Mhm.
that way. But these renewables still come with a consequence to wildlife because there's this infrastructure that's on the ground. Let's say we're talking about solar because I live in New Mexico and we have, solar
Solar
is going to
panels
be an up and
everywhere.
coming thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about having solar installed in, big open spaces that currently don't have any humans. They're
Mm.
just big open landscapes. And so that's, while solar could be really good for us, a deer might think that's a different answer, right? Like it might be
Yeah.
right on the place that that doe wants to have her fawn. And
Oh,
so I guess, yeah, that's probably the biggest threat that I see is just our human population is growing. We like to recreate and live in the same places as wildlife. And I don't know if we have a good way yet to rectify those two things and make them happen in a way that makes sense for us and for wildlife and ecosystems.
thank you for that answer. And thank you for bringing up habitat fragmentation because I think that it might be something that the public doesn't really think about. I know I don't think about it. And I think maybe people have this bias of like not in my backyard, of like understanding that we need renewables, but maybe we should put those solar panels where we live already, where we've already had an impact to the landscape. And maybe that we put them within big urban cities that are already used and already like that land has already been kind of designated to humans, other than maybe putting it in a place that where we don't exist yet. Right. And to think
Yeah.
of what else does exist in that area, what is already there. Is that a natural system that has yet to be touched and should it stay untouched, other than it becoming a new area for kind of resource extraction or creation of resources such as solar? I think it's a very good call out because I don't think it is on everyone's top of mind if that's the impact of it. That when you go into these places that we now habitat and recreate, that it is a natural system and we are going to have an impact. What do you think is kind of the next steps that we need to do? Is it more education of the public? Is it more policy change? How do we kind of combat habitat fragmentation?
Oh, that is a tricky question from all angles, I guess. Yeah,
Okay.
everything from knowing where animals prefer to be, so the on the ground research of deploying GPS collars on deer in a certain area or elk or pronghorn and seeing where they move and if they have migratory pathways that go through a certain area, perhaps working to conserve those in a way that makes sense, especially if it's in an
Mm,
area that is slated for development in one way or another, or more roads or whatever. I guess that's one piece is sort of knowing where things are happening on the landscape. And you could do that with on the ground research or, just anecdotal research, even, or deploying remote cameras and seeing what animals are there. Certainly in my expertise is not in policy, but I could probably see some policies that could be in place, like maybe like you mentioned, like not installing solar in these open landscapes. And I mean,
yeah, like urban
that's,
development, kind of maybe
yeah,
using that better than
yeah.
new land.
Yeah. Even day-to-day things that people can do, like don't have excessive trash because
Hmm.
landfills creates their space too. And that was a resource that was extracted from somewhere else that now is going in the trash and was not properly used or used as much. So yeah, little things, I guess, but yeah, that's going to be a tricky thing for us to tackle, right? There's some great habitat work that happens. So habitat enhancement in the form of like prescribed fires that used
Hmm.
to be, at least in the Western US and in New Mexico, there used to be a lot of fire on the landscape. It was just sort of a
Hmm.
natural thing that occurred. And with humans living here, we stop fires from happening, but that's really not the best scenario for the trees or the habitat or the wildlife that live there. So bringing some of that back, which we've
Hmm.
begun to do, there's some optimism there for humans to be able to recognize that, yeah, the landscape should look a little different than what it does now, and here's some ways we can make it better.
Yeah, rectify it, kind of rectify
Yeah.
our consequences that we've already changed the landscape and being like, okay, how do we go back to a natural system? And I think what you mentioned was a really, really good point of being like, we first need to actually understand the natural system, and having these baseline measurements and this baseline data is so important of knowing what is the population, where does the population go, what do they use a certain ecosystem or environment for. That's so valuable to have. And I feel like that's why work that you guys do is so important to have that baseline kind of population dynamic. And one kind of common misconception when we talk about conservation is this idea that conservation and hunting are mutually exclusive. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to this and speak to how the Department of Fish and Game kind of controls licensing and hunting, because it's another big part of what you guys do is looking at hunting licenses in terms of kind of population size and population health.
It's an interesting history, and I hunt now. I did not grow up a hunter though.
Mm,
So I guess I have maybe kind of a unique perspective in the fact that I didn't know this stuff that I'm about to say
Yeah.
when I even when I was an adult, like I was a young
Yeah.
adult before I learned this, but yeah, so hunters are actually sort of some of the first conservationists, and they figured out a really interesting way to pay for conserving animals on the landscape. And it came from kind of a selfish thing. So hunters, for one, kind of made a problem for themselves in the fact that there
Mhm.
was market hunting and just outright slaughter of all sorts of species back in the day. But at the same time, folks in that community realized, like, hey, we can't keep doing this. Like, there's going to not be these species if we continue to harvest them and kill them in this way just for their
Mhm.
pelts or for their feathers. And so hunters themselves had sort of this break check that
Yeah.
they kind of built in, and they're like, if we want these animals here into the future, we're going to have to quit doing this, at least in the way that we are doing it right now, and let's like figure out a way that is going to maintain these species. So what's really cool about, I guess, what I get to do in my folks in my agency is that we work with what's called the Pittman Robertson Act
Okay.
and dollars. And so through this market hunting and we can't keep killing all these animals came all of these innovations on like how do we now conserve wildlife, right? Like
Mhm.
if we want it here, we're going to have to do something about it, learn about it, have somebody manage it and figure out what the right path forward is. And so through that, there was some innovation on like, all right, well, hunters are the ones that are using this resource. And sometimes I hesitate to say resource because we're all in this ecosystem together. But
Yeah.
so they developed this tax on guns and ammunition through the Pittman Robertson Act. And so every firearm or ammunition that is purchased, there's a tax that goes into this pot of money for states that
Oh,
then use to manage these species. And so like most of my salary is paid by that. And it was,
that's
you know,
crazy.
it was established in the time where sort of the only firearms and ammunition purchased were for hunting generally. But still, like hunters figured out a way to pay for conservation in that manner. You know, there's not another model I've seen in another country that works quite as well. Through that, we have what's called the North American model of wildlife conservation. And so it's sort of this series of ethical ways that we're going to manage wildlife. So it should be scientifically driven, it's managed by states, it should be available to all people. Like, so we have a public draw.
Mhm.
It's not just, essentially, hunting is not just for the really wealthy people everywhere. Like,
Mhm.
it is available for folks who
Everybody.
want to harvest an elk so they can eat it and
Yeah.
share it with their family. Yeah, so through hunters, we got to kind of where we are today. Now, that being said, we are still a little focused on big game species and the ones that we can hunt. And
Mhm.
I see a value in that because people like to see these big dynamic species, but it's sometimes there's maybe not as much interest in other species that are also very important, I guess I'll
Mm.
say. You know, one thing that we talk about is like we have this funding source right now, but there could be a lot of other funding sources too. I don't know if you've heard of RAWA. It was a bill that was
Mm-mm.
introduced into Congress that had a lot of support just for more funding for wildlife species and a bigger variety of species. It got some traction in Congress. Anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I guess we're looking to diversify on how we get funding too,
Yeah,
right? Is the fact that it's currently funded by hunters mostly, you know, has a kind of, it's
a
maybe not
bias to it
as,
to an extent.
yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Nicole, thank you so much for explaining that and for kind of going down the history of conservation in terms of funding because I just assumed that the funding for your department and for like wildlife biology and wildlife conservation, I just assumed it was coming from government. I didn't assume that it was coming from taxes associated to rifle sales. And to that was a historic way to funnel conservation back in the day when the only rifle sales was for hunting. Like there was that direct kind of correlation between the two. I had no idea that most of the funding was coming from hunting. I think that's really interesting and a really cool kind of full system way of funding this. But I do think that you're right of like kind of going into modern day times, it does put a bias on conservation of that one species because it has an intrinsic link back to hunting and to why we want to hunt and why we want to focus on that game in particular. And while, yes, that will have consequence for the rest of the natural system, I think you are right to be like some species don't get the love and the conservation that they deserve. And I think sometimes that could be a human bias as well, that we usually preserve things that are cute and fluffy that we like, that we can kind of have a connection to. I don't think many people are going to be like, you know what, we really need to preserve this one type of salamander versus like a little baby cat. You know what I mean? Like we're going to choose the baby cat every single time because it's cute and it reminds us our home pets, right? So there is that bias to it. As a someone outside of conservation, I think it is interesting that hunters are kind of the first conservationists because I don't go there. I know a lot of people probably don't go there as like their first interpretation of it. How do you guys control ticket numbers? I know you said it was an open lottery system, so everyone has the ability to hunt. Do you guys do it by population numbers? Do you do it by size that you're only allowed to collect males this season? How does that work?
Yeah, a variety of ways we do that. It kind of goes back to those surveys that we fly in the helicopter. And it's really rooted in science, honestly, is the answer. Like, we assess a population and we say, all right, the trend has been whatever. There are 20,000 elk in this
Mhm.
population, and that can sustain this number of males being harvested, this number of females being harvested. And so at that level, once we've, baseline looked at it on a biology level and how many can be harvested while still maintaining that population, because we're not looking to annihilate it, but in a sustainable way so that maintains 20,000 elk. There's a certain number that can be harvested while still maintaining 20,000 because there's young that are being
Mm,
born every year. And then we put those numbers into a draw. And so
okay.
not every hunter is going to be successful. Let's say success rate is like 25% and
Yeah.
you want to, harvest 25, let's say male elk. You can actually
Yeah.
offer 100 licenses because only 25 of them are going to be successful. And usually we do that through
Okay.
what's called a draw system. And so if you're interested, you can put your name into this system for a random drawing, and if you're lucky, you get drawn. So yeah, but it
Yeah,
is
you
really
get one.
rooted in
I
in science, though.
That's wonderful that it comes back to that data and again, that like boots on the ground knowledge of what's happening with the population. And I wanted to maybe ask a more general question next, but speaking of kind of population conservation and just speaking of that as a whole, is there something currently that worries you about the future? Is there something that gives you hope in terms of conservation? What are your opinions on those two things?
What worries me is what we talked about earlier and just that fragmentation of the landscape.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that maybe what people don't often think about is that we rely on intact ecosystems, and I'm not just talking that there are elk always on the landscape, but just our pollinators and waterways
Hmm.
that provide clean water.
Holistic.
Yeah, holistically, yeah. And we are part of that ecosystem. And if we don't have the ecosystem that's functioning, we're going to have a really hard time as like
Mm,
humans and as a species. So the fragmentation of the landscape is something that does bring me a little pause, but at the same time, you talk to anybody and they value wildlife, right?
hmm.
They don't have
Yeah.
to be a hunter to value wildlife. Maybe they like to watch their birds in their backyard, or
Yeah.
maybe they just like the fact that, there are grizzly bears somewhere in the world, right? Like they'll never see a grizzly bear, but they like the fact that they're there. So people
Yeah.
value wildlife. I guess I'm not sure I've met anybody who doesn't value wildlife. So I think that gives me some hope, and there's a lot of new cool technological advances that I've seen just in my career that can help us make better decisions on,
Mm.
where to focus resources, or maybe where to do habitat work, or what a particular population might need. So yeah, that gives me a lot of hope.
That's wonderful. No, that's a wonderful answer. And I think it is true. I've never met somebody who doesn't love the natural system or isn't interested in understanding more about animals because I think that they are just so beautiful and fascinating. And yeah, I know that there's some species that I will never see, but I am still obsessed with blue whales. I would love to see a blue whale. I don't think it's ever going to happen, but like I do love to see photos of them and to read about them and to see how they're doing, and there is that genuine kind of curiosity in that species, that animal. And I think every single person kind of has their like top critters for some reason that they became obsessed with either as a kid or as an adult. So I do agree with you. I think that is kind of something that's very hopeful. One thing that you mentioned was the role of technology, and I was wondering if we could spend a little bit more time there. When in terms of technology, is there anything specific that you're nerding out about or really excited about? Or like what are the big moves in technology that you think that are going to help conservation?
Yeah, I really can geek out about GPS tracking
Okay.
technology. Yeah. So when I started in this field, that was barely a thing. It was kind of not a thing. And so we had to use what were called radio transmitters. So it's a little, kind of like a little radio station that you attach as a collar onto an animal. And then you have to go out with this receiver and this big antenna. And then you
Oh
kind
my
of,
goodness.
yeah, it's like really intense. You get an idea of where the animal is located, right? And
Mhm.
but now we have great GPS technology where we can just use the same device, like the same size, but it's equipped with a little GPS transmitter, and that transmits locations so much more regularly to satellites and then
Mhm.
to our emails or to a server that we can go look. So that's technology that has really allowed us to turn a corner in what we're doing and learn a whole lot more with just kind of almost the same level of effort, right? We can just
Mhm.
get multiple GPS locations from an animal rather than just a couple and see where they move in
One
the
or two.
wintertime when,
Yeah.
yeah, when we can't access it because there's a bunch of snow or something. And even just yesterday, man, I talked to this new company who's developing a tiny, tiny transmitter. So usually we're
Oh,
thinking of
cool.
like a dog collar that has,
Mhm.
GPS system that requires some weight to it because there's a battery. So the animal has to carry around that battery, but it's not massive, right? But there's this
Mhm.
solar GPS ear tag, like tiny, 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 like the size of maybe a few keys, like house
Oh,
keys,
cool.
that now it's like so much less invasive, right? Like you wouldn't
Mhm.
have to put it on an animal. And yeah, so there's a lot of those innovative technologies that are happening. So that's what I'm presently geeking out about. But it also creates some headaches for me because I did not expect that I would have to deal with millions and millions of data points. I
Mm.
right? Like now we
Yeah,
have all this data
yeah,
coming
yeah.
in, and how do I organize all that data from all those species and where, across the state that we're getting
Mhm.
locations on all the time. But yeah, it's a cool problem to have, I'll say.
Yeah, definitely like a good problem to have, but I could imagine that, right? Because all of a sudden, which I think you just described, is that you have richness to your data instead of having one wonky data point that has a bunch of different components to try to put. I couldn't imagine walking out with like a receiver, a monitor, like every kind of component of that instead of having like one wonky data point to be like, I think they potentially are in here. You get their entire movements of where they are at all times. And that's amazing. That air tag that you said, or that sorry, that new transmitter on an ear and the fact that it's so non-invasive and that it's solar powered instead of having a battery pack, like very, very cool. And
Yeah.
that would be really wonderful to see kind of that future of where you're gonna kind of move to GPS and to tagging. That's fantastic.
Yeah. The fact that it's so small now, like, just blows my mind. I was even shocked when I talked to these folks yesterday that I was like, that'll be on the animal for 3 years. They're like, yeah,
Whoa.
just little solar panel there. And then, yeah,
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, like it all comes back to trying to not stress them out on their terrible no good day when they're
yeah,
abducted by a net and they have no idea what's going on. You know what I mean? Like anything to make them a little bit less stressed during that moment. That's fantastic. That's
yeah,
very, very
yeah.
cool. Nicole, if you do happen to find yourself, I mean, I'm an avid hiker. I love to go outside. What would be your advice to someone who is within this like natural ecosystem? How would they minimize their impact to the populations around them? Anything like off the top that you follow, maybe like stay on a path, don't bushwhack, don't leave garbage, like anything that you kind of follow when you're out in the field.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're hiking on trails, staying on trails is pretty key because wildlife that live in that area, if it's a common thing that's happening all the time, they sort of know where this risk or this stressful thing for them is. Seeing a human somewhere else can be a little more stressful to them. If you don't hike on trails all the time, which I don't all the time, but sort of just being respectful, right? If you come upon a fawn, like, okay, maybe snap a picture and then go in the other direction and leave
Move
it
on.
alone. And yeah, just sort of
Yeah.
being respectful to like you're now in their living room. So maybe just chill out for a sec and enjoy it for a moment and then let them be. Yeah.
Yeah, go the opposite way. Yeah, take a
Yeah.
little quick photo, take 5 seconds, but then get out of there, and if it's like a
Yeah.
baby, maybe don't stress out mom or the baby if she's by herself in her living room. Yeah, you did
Yeah.
just, like, ascend on her
Yeah.
nursery, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the last one, Nicole, before we go, I just wanted to maybe ask, it's a little bit of a lofty question, but for anybody who's listening, if they're interested in conservation, if they're maybe considering a career in conservation and entering into STEM fields, I was wondering if you would kind of speak to your advice to them, who is someone who's just starting their career in wildlife biology or conservation.
My advice would be, so generally in the field that I work, graduate level degrees are pretty common.
Mhm,
And so I would suggest like have some interest in, I don't know, as you're taking classes or just being a person in the world, what interests you about the ecosystem? For me, it was like this dynamic thing between predators and prey is chased by predators. And like that is super interesting to me. But it could be other things, right? Like seeing birds, migrating. People can focus on that. So like having some focus of interest and maybe following that through into graduate school if wildlife biology and a career, in field biology is something you might want to do. At the same time, just like reaching out to people that do something that you think you might want to do is really
mhm.
valuable. And I think that can help people decide on a path even. Like maybe you talk to this person and dang, field biology is not what I really want to do. I like GIS or
Yeah,
something. So, yeah, just
yeah.
talking to the people in the jobs that you think you want to do can be pretty valuable too, it seems like. And reaching out to them and saying, hey, can I join you in the field? Can I go on a capture and see what it's like to be doing it? And yeah, experiencing it firsthand.
Mm. No, I think that's a wonderful answer. And I think that kind of brings us back to how you first started, of like how you went from a zookeeper to a field biologist, of just like trying a couple projects in your undergrad and talking to people and having that field experience early on and that hands-on training to kind of have that. I feel like that changed your life. All of a sudden
Yeah.
you were like, yeah, okay, this is what I want to do. And this is
Yeah.
something that exists. Like you can go outside and capture these animals. Amazing. I'm in.
Yeah.
So that advice is fantastic, of having that real world experience, talking to people that you might share a common interest and then kind of pull on that thread, follow that thread and see where it goes. And any advice for those, because it is a grad based program, it sounds like you kind of have to have a master's or a PhD. Anyone who's within those times of their life right now, any advice for somebody who's like in year 2 or year 3 of a PhD and they want to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but maybe they're not there yet. Anything that helped you get through it? Any advice to them?
Oh man. I drug my finishing on for like too many years. I got a job
Mm.
and didn't finish until, several years into a job. So finish it if you can finish it early, finish it on yeah, before you get a job. But yeah, I mean, I guess perhaps just reaching out to people. So if you're interested in a certain field, kind of like grease the bearings by contacting some of those people in that field
Mm,
now and saying, "Hey, like I am getting my degree here in the next 6 months. I'm wondering if you have any job openings." And yeah, like
mhm.
the light at the end of the tunnel for me, I guess, was the fact that I get to put all of my training to work and like in a real world setting and make actual management recommendations on how to best manage a resource. So I guess like greasing those bearings, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, and just reaching out to people who might be hiring and saying, do you have anything open or do you know anybody who might? And here's
Yeah.
what my expertise is. And would that fit in anywhere you can think?
No, that's wonderful. Just like, hello, hi, my name is da da da, and I'm about to get
Yeah.
my degree. I swear I'm about to finish it. Like, please, please give me an
Yeah.
out other than grad school. Cause it is a grind, right? Like you do hit that point that you're like, oh my goodness, it is time to move on. It is time to actually put this skill to use. And that's wonderful that that kind of was your motivation of being like, yeah, that was the light at the end of your tunnel of being like, okay, I get to actually use this knowledge and I get to help and make management recommendations and get to help this population of animals that I love. Nicole, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I learned so much. I'm still blown away by your job. I think it's so cool. Thank you for talking about conservation and hunting and kind of the future of conservation and what excites you in that space. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful chatting to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. I appreciate given the opportunity to to chat about something that I'm so passionate about. And yeah, thank you.
I appreciate it, and you're welcome. Like, I just love learning about it, and I just think it's so cool, so thank you for coming on to the show, and thank you anyone who is listening. This is the Smoko Podcast, and we will see you guys next week. Bye.